Welcome back to another episode of the Altmed podcast. With me, as always, Mitch Kurtz in the co-host seat, and in the guest hot seat today, we have from Canopy Growth, the biggest cannabis company in the world. I think we'll shortly find out. It's Ben Quirin. Welcome, Ben.
Hey guys, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's pretty excited to be here today. I know we've been on a bit of a journey trying to get to this point. We have a few cancellations, so apologies in advance.
No stress. It's we're just absolutely wrapped to have you here. We know it's heaps to unpack about what's kind of happening here in Australia and all the wisdom and experience that you carry from Canada, operating here. But before we dive into that, maybe as we sort of often do, can you give us a bit of an overview of your career to date? Really, anyone who's seen your LinkedIn or worked with you would know you've had a bit of an interesting journey to get into cannabis. So maybe take us back to where it all started.
Yeah, I've spent the majority of my life working in the tech sector. So whether it's telco, whether it's mobility, whether it's software and services and so on. So I spent a lot of time in that entire space. I've worked in pretty much Asia Pacific, the EMEA region, and working into North American companies quite extensively. My passion is emerging markets, right? I love getting into new territories, being able to build something from the ground up. And ultimately, that's where this opportunity sort of tapped on my door. I mean, I've seen what medicinal cannabis or cannabis has done before it was called medicinal cannabis, how it supported actual patients or people in need to be able to improve the way they live, right? Whether it's pain, whether it's seizure management and so on. And there was a lot more that was going on in that space. But to be frank, didn't know enough about how it was being accessed, apart from probably the black market or i.e. the green market per se. So I was very fortunate. I was approached by a very good friend who was leading Canopy's efforts around a global expansion. So Dave approached me at that point in time and said, listen, we need someone who is going to be able to lead us out in this part of the world. Someone who understands how to, firstly, establish a strategy, read regulation, understand how we navigate it accordingly, but also how do we get to a position that we build the right team here to be able to enable us to expand our footprint, not only in Australia, but using Australia as a springboard across the whole of Asia Pacific. So tying in with the global strategy that Canopy was working towards. So from that good fortune, there's no better way to join this sector than work for some of the leading entrepreneurs in the area who actually took the plunge, led the way, and opened the door. So the likes of Mark Zakulis and Bruce Linton, who probably two of the greatest leaders I've worked for in this space and learned a hell of a lot. So I think one of the things that someone said to me when I first joined, when you join in this sector and you're joining a startup, it's like doing an accelerated MBA. So every year you're in this sector is like 7 years somewhere else. So yeah, that probably gives you a bit more context.
Kind of like an MCBA.
Yeah, very true. Maybe that's something we should put out there.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that being in Australia at the moment, I would say. And maybe just to clarify for the people at home, especially the Australian people back home, well, here rather, the difference between Canopy and Spectrum, just for some clarity, because I think Spectrum might get thrown around a little bit more locally.
Yeah, definitely. So Spectrum's our local product brand. So from a medical standpoint, Spectrum is the division of our organization that's very much branded towards our medical range of products. So you'll find Spectrum in Canada, you'll find Spectrum in Europe, you'll find Spectrum in Australia today. And it's very much how we've built that framework to support HCPs through to, whether it's prescribers through to patients and so on, to better understand that framework. So we build a number of materials that support doctors to be more informed around the decisions they make. So that's the Spectrum side of the organization. Canopy is the holding company, right? It's the company that ultimately is the Canopy that has a number of different brands and products that sort of sit under the Canopy.
Gotcha.
The global brand will be recognized as Canopy Growth.
Yeah, gotcha. So I guess maybe we'll just kick off with a couple of questions around the basic trends that you guys see, being one of the larger, if not largest company. Very keen to know the kinds of trends, insights little bit of the data, how you do that piece, because I imagine it's quite a bit more thorough than others out there. So yeah, keen to get a little bit of what you can share with us.
Yeah, let me start. When I started this 4 years ago, I came in here and I started up in a home office, right? And we didn't have all the systems. We didn't have everything that we're starting with. I was very fortunate we could tap into what we had from a global perspective. And when I say global, at that point in time, global was actually Canada. Okay. There wasn't much more outside of Canada apart from a footprint that we started to establish and some partnerships that we're establishing. But the framework was starting to give us a better understanding of the decisions that we needed to make around how do we enter a market, what decisions we needed to make around what products, what services, how do we deploy that? Do we go in and build cultivation sites? Do we go in and build manufacturing and so on and so on? So in that very early stage, that's what the trend was. It was around how do we drive that? But then there was also around the policy, right? How do we incorporate that and understand what was out there that enabled patients to gain access? Or was it purely a roadblock? So we had to incorporate all that into our data and actually state, what's the landscape? What are we dealing with today? But then how do you take that and then enable us to make decisions around, ultimately, how do we build a business in each of these geographies that we wanted to enter? Because, we're not non-for-profit, but we are very centric towards how do we enable products and services to be deployed to, whether it's doctors, whether it's pharmacists, whether we're supporting them to support their patients more effectively. So one of the things I put as a mandate to my team when we started to build this was, I need to be able to do the what if scenario. So what if anything? So looking at everything we do and saying, if I want to understand, what is the footprint, what's the penetration we're gaining now, we can actually recall those numbers accordingly. So we can actually understand clearly, how do we service that more effectively? How do we enable what staff we need to put on the ground to support that? What initiatives do we need to put in place to support the outreach efforts that we need to do? How do we make sure when we're developing materials and so on, those materials are relevant? Right? If we're going to invest in education, why do we want to do that? So my question to my team always is why? What's the driver for it? What's going to enable us to expand the reach? Because if all I was doing is purely just putting materials out there as goodwill, it doesn't drive anything. So it's not driving the adoption. So we really wanted to expand that footprint. So when we look at data in a number of different ways. We can look at pure numbers and say, what are we achieving from a revenue point of view? What are we seeing from the number of bottles we're actually prescribing to patient, what the ratio numbers are, what is the life cycle of a patient and so on. So we're looking at various elements there to basically gain a better insight to the decisions we need to make. And by doing that, we can actually say we can build a more sustainable business. So we can actually continue to be not here just for the first 3 months, not the 12 months, but we can look at a 5-year plan and say we can be here in 5 years. And this is our roadmap to be able to be successful enough to do that.
Yeah, well, it's I suppose even in the short time that the market feels like it's been around, and I don't know, I kind of wake up some days and it feels like it only started yesterday, and then other times it feels like it's already been 10 years. But I think the patient experience, going back to when you would have first started working with Spectrum products, and as you talked about the outreach efforts to go and educate doctors, I mean, I think there's a massive uptake on education by doctors. But I'm kind of interested, do you look back now and sort of, are you comfortable with what the patient experience is like in Australia, or do you feel like we've still got a way to go?
I think we've still got a way to go. Okay. I think it's improved a hell of a lot. Okay. I think we've been in a position where I remember when I first started, and I remember speaking to a young couple who their child was actually suffering from epilepsy, had multiple seizures per day. This was my second day, mind you, starting here in Australia. And I was part of a media conference on behalf of the Victorian government and attended that conference. And I remember the parent turning around to me and said, please commit to continuing to do the research and enabling products for our patients. So when we looked at that, and she said to me, she goes, my husband has been to jail. My husband has been released. And what we were doing is just enabling us to provide products to patients. Enabling us to provide products to our son to enable him to have a better quality of life. Because basically medicinal cannabis was improving his life cycle in regards to less seizures per week, less seizures per day, and so on. So I think that element for me was quite critical to look at that. But that patient journey at that point in time, 4 years ago, could take up to 10 months, okay, before they're receiving one bottle.
Yeah.
All right. So we've come a long way, mind you, right? So we've come to a position where, I think up until yesterday, I think there was one particular member of my team who came out and said, she was with a doctor and the doctor had actually prescribed medicinal cannabis, and he'd stated he went through the SAS portal and that was pretty much approved within half an hour. Okay. So we've come a long way. So we've come a long way in that basis. But now it's the ability to say, having that approval and then fulfilling that to a patient, what is the timeline to make that happen as well?
Yeah. And it's also, I mean, it must be interesting as well coming from, I guess, Canopy. And I fully appreciate that. Yeah, as much as there is all of that wisdom in Canada, Australia's journey has been different. And so you guys have very much kind of been, I would imagine, given an enormous amount of autonomy to really develop the strategy of how to work within Australia. But yeah, I'm just interested in the fact that Canopy has Spectrum for its kind of pharmaceutical medical side, but it's got a number of other brands that deal with other areas. What do you see as the kind of the future role for all of that? Is it too early to be talking about, the potential entry into Australia for those kinds of brands and products?
Listen, I think we're starting to see more questions being asked and an awareness being generated. So I think let's talk about CBD. CBD is broadly being talked around, a wellness product. Is it a pharmaceutical product? Where does it sit? How do we classify it accordingly? You start to see the trends of what's occurring overseas. Say, you go to the United States, people can actually buy, whether it's a tincture, whether they can buy a spray, whether they can buy, gummies, for example. What are the different formats that can be used? We've built a category of different brands today. I mean, we go anywhere from Martha Stewart gummies through to our Tweed brands that we've had in Canada since the start of the organization.
I can sense our audience is getting very excited listening. It's like, oh, is this what the future is?
Listen, I mean, I love going to our roadmap sessions because our innovation team and marketing team come together to truly understand, back to your point earlier on, what are the insights telling us? What do we actually need to bring to market to enable our consumer? And that consumer carries a different hat. It could be a patient. It could be an adult who's looking for some sort of mood modulation. So i.e., they want to chill out or they want to get a little bit of a high. The world is changing in that context. So we're starting to see that evolve quite a bit, but it's understanding what the consumer is looking for and where that consumer fits in. So that's why when we look at our organization, that's why we've got the different categories. So we can play very medical and we can play in that criteria. We can tick all the boxes around meeting the specifications for products and so on. And we also have the technology to support you to
I was going to say the technology sits in a nice little overlap area. You've got something that I'm going to say is medical behind you, but I'm just sort of speculating that it could be used for other purposes.
Only in Canada, obviously.
Only in Canada.
I am fully aware there are individuals in Australia who will purchase our products to consume basil or lemon. There are these different categories.
It's a terpene thing.
Yeah, terpene, exactly.
So, and part of that from a household product, that category evolves quite broadly. So I think from that perspective, we appreciate these products need to be out there. But the great thing about it is we've got a product that's safe.
Yeah.
These aren't products that haven't been tested, they haven't been put through clinical trials and so on. That's where it becomes critical for us to be able to say, how do we put things out there that set the regulation, enable it to be safe, but at the same time, don't inhibit patients or consumers from gaining access?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I imagine that you would have been quite instrumental or had quite a role in that government relations part, especially early in the piece, being one of the larger companies. Can you take us through any of that? I'm imagining this, it's probably a little bit prickly, but keen to hear what you can share at the very least.
Hey, listen, I would have to say in the very early days, we had a very forward-thinking state government in Victoria. They came out to Canada and openly, they approached Canopy to come to Canada, come to Australia and establish ourselves here, because they realized that we'd actually put in place a strong foundation. I think there was a lot of, if I put it politely, there was a lot of hype at that point in time around opportunity and the commercial opportunity around establishing an industry and what it can bring and how it can be built out. It was about the number of jobs, how much money an organization can come in and spend, and so on. So I think from that perspective, we've seen quite a journey on that. I've had the pleasure of meeting with a number of senior ministers, both state and federal government, to understand what our plans are, what we're looking to do, but also to look at how do we make change. The driving rules today. I mean, I love what the guys are doing with drive change at the moment and the initiative that's been driven there. I think Fiona Patton and B. Mohammed and various others have done a great job in driving that forward. There are things that need to change, right? That is a showstopper. At present, there are a number of patients today who actually are better placed when they are taking their medication than when not taking medication.
Yeah.
From a safety point of view, I think that's where we start to look at it and say, that's enabling us to have safer drivers on the road than not.
Yeah. And same with, and people on heavy duty painkillers. I mean, if they're just restlessly experiencing symptoms, but that's totally legal anyway. But no, they're doing great work. But I suppose, in those early days, was there, in the sort of haste to actually establish a market, I feel like there was, if I kind of have a snapshot of the last 4 or 5 years, there was a real interest in first bringing importers to the table, because the product, options outside of, the sort of fledgling domestic market here was obviously greater. So a lot more reliance on import. And then I think as we've evolved and more is being done onshore, we're starting to sort of see that imports are almost, kind of left in a bit of a place where people are sort of saying, I guess they're necessary for now, but they're not part of the future of the industry. I mean, is that something you have a view on, or something you've observed as well?
Yeah, listen, I think import play a critical role to the survival of this industry. Let's be clear. I think if longer term success of this industry and enabling patient access, plus enabling a platform for us to continue to expand our products, we need to continue enabling imports. I don't think the local players will have sufficient resource to enable them to invest in the innovation, the research, and enabling it to be more cost effective. I think that has to change. I think the expectation, we've done the modeling. We can tell you quite clearly, the ability to produce locally here and actually produce a product will become cost prohibitive for a patient. There are people who are to give you different business cases. I respect that. Each person accounts for things differently, but I think we've...
if you pay the right accountant, you get the
answer you want, right? Whatever formula you want to produce. So I think, listen, the reality for us is we see a key role for imported products in the way that we continue to do it. We will continue to look at how we develop that, because I can tell you now, when I came into the industry 4 years ago, the term I used was raped and pillaged of patients, right? Because I think it was disgusting how patients were being treated in the early days. Because the price points that people were charging a patient were ridiculous. We made a commitment to come in, and I had the support of Bruce and Mark at that time, who both turned around and said, make it affordable for patients. Let's not go rock bottom. Let's not drop everything, but let's make it affordable. So I can tell you now, we shattered barriers at that point in enabling patient access and pricing. At that time, I don't think many people liked me, to be frank. They probably still don't, but hey, we had the thought process for us at that point in time was, how do we make this more accessible for patients? Right? And the education we were delivering, I would walk into places and say, we'd give it to you.
I also think there's a variety piece at stake here. Like, in terms of, there's been a very big shift towards Australian made products, and I think that's great, and it's great for the industry. But sometimes some people want an Australian car, and some people want a German car or a Japanese car. And I think that will definitely, as we look towards the recreational, but also in the medical market, I think there are certain products that might provide a certain outcome for a certain type of patient that may not be available domestically. And I don't think that we should just shut off that medicine because, we only care about Australian made products. I think there's a broader picture here that is actually the well-being of the end user. And I think that's important.
Yeah, but the tension appears to lie in kind of what you're saying, Ben, to me at least, around, I guess imports then become, truly competitive with the Australian market because the cost base is so much less. I'm actually curious in that. I mean, I just, on a blind assumption, would have thought that Canada and Australia would be sort of similar, labor costs and things to produce. But I suppose when you're a company as big as Canopy Growth, the economy of scale really means you get a little bit more bang for your buck with some of the big projects. But yeah, I sort of, my sense is that the local producers, are perhaps in a kind of, not a protectionist racket, but they want to ensure that the industry survives here. But yeah, it's clearly, there's a tension with imports because of the cost aspect.
Yeah, listen, I'm for the industry locally. I'm all about building out that ecosystem because I think we all have a role that we can play in building out the industry locally. I mean, it's interesting. I presented to the leadership group last week, I should say, and explaining to our headquarters and some of our European colleagues around what's evolved here in Australia and how that is building out. There's quite an extensive ecosystem. There are importers, there's distributors, there's CMOs, there's advocacy groups, there's HCPs and so on and so on. And I think I broke it up into 10 different categories, right? So that built out a picture, built out an ecosystem that actually enabled us to break that down accordingly. But then what we did then, we broke that down and said, who's playing in what category? Who's actually doing something today and delivering an outcome? We actually look very closely at quarterly reports and annual reports that are actually issued by all the various companies that are publicly listed here in Australia to understand where a company's situated today and what their plans and commitment is to development in the market. So I think from that perspective, we take a very different angle to maybe a lot of others in a truly understanding what is the cost base? How do you enable yourself to be a sustainable business longer term so you can continue playing in this space? Because the quickest way to get a doctor off site or a pharmacist off site or even a patient off site is by having stockouts.
Yeah, I can, and it's, I mean, I find that with some of those annual reports, the numbers actually tell more of the accurate story than some of the written text that accompanies. But anyway,
and that's the other thing. There's a lot of press releases.
Yeah.
Rightly or wrongly, I know I get it. As a publicly listed company, you need to make your shareholders aware of what you're doing and so on. It's part of what we need to be able to manage accordingly, but we need to be able to back that up and deliver the outcomes that we're looking for.
I have noticed though, there's a lot of, and this obviously happens across many sectors other than medical cannabis, but just those puff pieces that say, company A has signed an in principle agreement. I mean, effectively, this could just be, two people at a bar just sort of saying, all right, you're on for a bet. But it's, look, these things clearly maintain shareholder
smoking a joint.
Hey.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think that's the thing. It's one of the things that people have always criticized us locally is, but you don't tell us enough about what you're doing. But people all know who Canopy is. Most people know who Spectrum is because there's a brand playing in this space. But we don't need to go out and say, I've just signed an agreement or I've signed an MOU to tell you that I'm about to receive a product from you.
Yeah.
For us, that doesn't play for anything. For me, it's the reason I want to come out and talk about things when we've actually delivered something, when we're actually doing something properly to be able to achieve that effectively. And that becomes critical, right? It's the ability to legitimize what we're doing by actually holding up to it and saying, if we're going to commit to delivering this, this is our plan.
Yeah.
Right, we've got a clear timeline and we know how we do it, but come back to me and check me on it accordingly.
Well, I think it's more powerful when you say, this is what we've done. We've helped X many people. We've done this for investors. We've done whatever your milestones are, as opposed to we will look to do this in the future sometime, potentially. It's a little bit of a different kind of vote of confidence, I think, that you get from the...
Sounds like you've both done a lot of comms work.
Market research. No, I was going to ask about the, I guess the well-being arm of Canopy. If we have some descheduling decisions that sort of come on in the next few years, do you guys actually, are you sitting on like a whole brand of like topicals and other things that might be able to just be introduced with a lot of ease? Is that kind of your position at the moment, or are you more interested in the market that might evolve if there's actually, you know, like for want of a better term, a recreational market established? Would you say that Canopy's a bit more of a bigger player in the rec market, or well-being, or both?
I think we play across all facets, right? I think we've got a strong DNA in our medical area. So we've been able to do that. We back it up with research. I mean, it's interesting. Before I come into these sort of calls, I get a nice briefing deck from my comms team who tell me everything that we've done recently. So at least I've got a wrap up of all the key things. And it's incredible to think about how much we still continue to our investment in medical and what we do on the research side. But on the wellness side, that's a key category for us because we're starting to see that evolve quite significantly. So particularly from what we're gathering from our insights, what we look at from, i.e. the CBD category and how that's evolved. And that's largely to do with what's happened in the United States, because federally at the moment, cannabis is not legal. But from a hemp point of view, there's opportunity to expand a hemp business across the board. So we've opened that up quite broadly, and we've partnered with people like Martha Stewart, for example. You may or may not know who Martha Stewart is, but Martha Stewart has come through with us, and we've developed a range of products that very much with a wellness angle built into that.
I was going to ask, is this recreational or wellness? Because I'm getting.
I was going to say Martha Stewart, the basketballer, yeah.
Yes. She's about 6'9", and but you know, when we start to look at that, they're the categories that we've opened up broadly. So we're starting to look at that. Yes, we play extensively in the recreational space as well. We won't shy away from that as an organization, but we only play where it's legally permissible to do so. So you know, we've built an entire platform in Canada, whether that's B2C, whether that's building out our own dispensaries and having our branded stores. So we have Tweed branded stores, we have Tokyo Smoke branded stores, plus we have other partnerships that we've evolved through the market. So when you look at that entire footprint, we look at that and say, here's a model, it's worked in Canada, right? And, you know, there's various stats in Canada to tell you that crime rates have dropped and various other things have looked at as well. And I'm pretty sure, I think it's been referenced in other chats that you guys have had over time. So when I look at that, I look at it and go, there's an entire ecosystem we can work with.
Yeah. And it's, I suppose as well, it's almost like, and I referenced before that the Australian journey's been different and will continue to evolve differently to Canada, but there's also scope to draw on the similarities between the two jurisdictions. I guess I'm just interested, I mean, how, we've seen certainly in the medical market that people went, you know, initially tinctures, and then flower has had this kind of boom. And what are some of the, I guess, just some of the trends that you can observe in Canada, even from a policy perspective around how they got to, you know, kind of legalizing recreational, and what, I guess, in a roundabout way, I'm kind of asking for a preview of what's to come for Australia, do you think?
Canada was very unique. They had a guy called Justin Trudeau. Okay, so politics is a very different play altogether. So a very different approach on that perspective. I think you know, there's a journey that needs to be on with our current political cohort to be able to bring them along that side. Interestingly, you do look at Canberra, and Canberra is the place where I can purchase or grow, or where I can grow cannabis at home in my own home. So it very, you know, when you think about it from a capital standpoint, listen, I think there's discussion that's being had at the moment. I think people are very interested in seeing how does this evolve, but I think it's the courage that needs to be taken to say, how do you take that step forward and actually establish this? I think everyone was watching New Zealand very closely last year. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of commentary going on around what's going to happen, how does this work, what's your position as Canopy Growth? I think a number of people quoted that we were committed to building facilities and building retail and so on in New Zealand. Frankly, we didn't commit to anything. All right. We were waiting for things to pass. We were very supportive of sharing experience and providing that input, not indifferent to what we do here. I will continue to work with, whether it's state or federal, to be able to state the lessons we've learned as an organization, but how you can do it properly. Because I think keep in mind, there was things that Canada did wrong in the very early stages in their deployment of their roadmap. But I think they would change in hindsight to enable that to be accelerated to build the industry accordingly. Because there are a number of players who've invested heavily in building out this industry. So the policy piece is critical in getting that framework that makes sense, so you can actually enable an industry to actually survive and actually prosper. Because you guys have referenced it a couple of times on this call. Canopy Growth remains the largest cannabis company globally. We are dual publicly listed, both in the US and Canada. So from our perspective, we've looked at our footprint and said, how do we build upon that to enable us to be able to play in every category where it's legally permissible to play with cannabis? Our company vision is, it's unleash the power of cannabis for the good, right? So we're literally looking at how we do that more broadly. So
yeah, it's great. I actually, as you were saying, that was reflecting on how all the kind of the policy comes from the courage that you just described. I mean, it would be refreshing to have that sort of level of political leadership where people aren't worried about admitting to the fact that they might have used cannabis recreationally. I mean, when I say might, I'm almost convinced that so many politicians in Canberra have. I mean, one only needs to look at some of the bills that they introduced to Parliament to know that they might still be under the influence, taking full advantage of the ACT regime. But no, I think that courage is really what's missing. I thought Victoria showed courage in 2016 in legalizing being the first state, and that was to something you referenced earlier, just in response to so many kids with epilepsy. But I suppose since that time that the states onboarded medical cannabis regimes, I don't think we've seen enough courage and leadership. I feel like we've just stalled. Everyone's accepted that the industry parameters are, CBDs are Schedule 4, everything else is Schedule. You know what I mean? Like everything just sort of feels like it's been just etched into stone. So I don't know. I hope that we get a little bit more leadership in the future. But I've got a kind of question for you, which is just more around, I suppose, just the background that you had in tech. You described how you'd gone into markets with, and I know you worked previously for BlackBerry and others, but is cannabis kind of the craziest sort of product that you've ever worked with, and why is that?
Listen, I don't consider cannabis a crazy product. Cannabis is an ingredient, right? At the end of the day, it's another ingredient that can be looked at. I've had the good fortune that my best friend basically graduated as a naturopath when he first started. So I got all sorts of alternate medicine put towards me in the very early days. So I very rarely get a prescription for something, right? Yeah. It's unless there's a need for it. I think from that perspective, I had a great deal of exposure to, whether it was a mushroom extract, whether it was, using vitamin C or magnesium and so on to try and look at how I treat ailments and so on, or recovery from sport. So I think from my perspective, cannabis isn't a crazy space. Cannabis is crazy because of the fact that nothing's really in place right now. We're trying to build it. We're building it from the ground up, right? In the tech world, you went in and you tried to deploy technology, but people were a lot more accepting of technology because they knew what it was. At the moment, you're dealing with an ingredient that everyone turned around and said, this is evil. This should be banned. I mean, prohibition came through and it was blocked everyone from gaining access to cannabis, right? So I think when we look at it from that perspective, it's that disruptive element of bringing an ingredient into play that enables us to go in and say, how do you unleash the power of this ingredient to deliver good? And I think for us at the moment there's so much good that it can be delivered and in various ways, but let's do it in the right way. And I think that's what we've committed ourselves to doing as an organization. But for myself personally, the exciting part is being able to surround myself by incredible individuals. there are so many passionate people that I've been able to bring on board over the time here who are actually prepared to dig their feet in and actually go hard. And I think you guys referenced one of them through conversations we had prior to this one. And the work I've seen of people, whether they're an MSL, whether they're medical director, whether they're commercial, whether they're quality assurance and so on, they're extremely committed to what they need to do every day. They're committed to enabling us to say, how do I get from bringing a product from Canada, landing in Australia, but making sure it lands in the hands of a patient?
Yeah.
And I tell a story about the kind of the passion that exists. And in this industry, I see it also sometimes in wine or beer. But I recall a time when I was working on a farm in America in the middle of absolutely nowhere, about 5 hours east of Seattle. And I would be there with really, for lack of a better term, a redneck type, demographic, let's say.
You would have fitted right in.
Yeah, I did fit straight in, let the beard out, all that. But I remember just, speaking to people who really didn't have the opportunity for further education or even basic education in some situations, really below the poverty line. And a lot of times, basically didn't know a lot about anything outside their town, let alone their state, let alone America. But as soon as you would talk to them about cannabis, they would turn into some kind of like molecular physicist talking about solvent extraction and the best way you shouldn't use butane, you should use ethanol, and then talking about the chemical reactions that happen. And I was just like, what is going on? Like, this person,
power of education.
Yeah, actually doesn't know left from right, doesn't know, thinks that the Middle East is next to the Pacific Northwest, but they don't actually know where, but they know all this, intricate detail about medicinal or cannabis over there. So I think, talking about that passion, it just brings to mind that type of character. Maybe that's a bit more extreme for the Australian example,
but no, it's definitely,
but that's where it started from.
Yeah.
Right. That's what that's the ground roots, right? Or the grassroots, I should say, of individuals who went out really hard. I mean, we've got an incredible advocacy lead in our organization called Hillary Black. I mean, if you look at some of the videos of the stories of Hillary and the work that she did from a very young age, Hillary's front and center of her thought process was, how do I make products available to people that need it? Okay. Didn't discriminate on what their needs were, but how do I make it available for them? And she's been a key proponent in the Canadian context on change. So I think for our perspective, people like that make a massive change. And that's the same passion that we look for in the people we hire. Because when I read a CV today, the CV tells me one story. It tells me you're qualified, okay? But culturally, are you ready for this? And I ask people the question, we're a cannabis company. How comfortable are you working in representing a cannabis company today? I'm telling you that we're solely medical. We do various other brands. So I always need to make sure that someone's comfortable with being able to represent who Canopy Growth is.
And if they turn around and say, I'm not sure about the devil's lettuce.
And we have had people who've walked out at that last minute.
Really?
Some people who haven't been company, they went through the entire process. They went for an interview, and then once they get to me, I asked that question, and it's really around, how comfortable are you? I want to make sure that when it comes to representing who we are as an organization, you're not afraid to say who we are as a company, okay? Because don't pigeonhole Canopy into one category. We represent a number of different areas. We have a broad portfolio, but it enables us to be able to actually have greater insight into this plant, because the research we gain from the recreational space or the research we gain from medical all comes out, because at the end of the day, it could be you, Andrew, it could be Mitch, or it could be me, who is the end user.
Yeah. I think it's funny because obviously we, being keen observers of the cannabis industry, both here in Australia and abroad, understand what canopy is. But I think in Australia, it's going to actually be quite interesting, if we get a sort of deregulation and a situation where these wellness and rec brands can sort of come into the market, because people will just sort of be like, oh, I didn't know you guys did all of that. Like, the canopy is, it's not kind of a brand for everyone sort of thing.
Oh, listen, I mean, if I think about it, I mean, I look around the room here, sitting in the corner of there, I've got a product of BioSteel. So we acquired a sports nutrition company about 18 months ago. Okay. At the moment, they're one of the fastest challengers in the sports nutrition brands in the North American market, so in the US. So they are now rapidly expanding. We've got some marquee athletes who are actually supporting that. Now, a number of people wouldn't realize that we actually play in sports nutrition as well as sports hydration. So that's another category, but that category evolves because all of a sudden you can actually include CBD into that category.
Yeah.
People looking at CBD for pre or post activity, and how do they support them accordingly?
I prefer during, actually, just in the middle of a run, just, few capsules. But, gets a little bit hard with the tincture bottle.
CBD gel.
Yeah.
But we need to track your activity purpose. To see what the output is.
Yeah. The second half of my run is always a lot better. But anyway.
There you go.
Very interesting. I have so many things I wanted to talk about based on what you've said. I think just quickly going back to what you were saying about, people walking out, because I had a thing before Andrew rudely cut me off. I actually remember having that exact experience. I've known I wanted to be working in the cannabis industry for a long time. And back in the day, before it was legalized, I went to see if I could get a role at, and people are going to judge me for this, but I didn't follow through, British American Tobacco. because I thought that in my head, the experience.
You had no moral compass?
Yeah, that was what I was trying to say. No, in my head, I was like, maybe that would give me the foundation for understanding, corporate cannabis, where it will go. But at the last minute, I got there and I'm like, I'm actually not comfortable working for a tobacco company. And I did that. I went, had the interview, and I was like, they're like, cool. And I'm like, I can't do it, actually. So I do understand that. And I had the opposite.
It's like, I get that you guys are legal, but I'd rather work for a cannabis company.
Yeah, they're like, good luck. It's not legalized yet. But anyway.
And it's crazy. I mean, I've had people walk in the door and don't realize that we're actually legal here.
Right.
Right. So that's the crazy part. Now you're actually applying for a role, but not clear that it's actually legal in the country yet. So you don't realize that there's a framework in place that supports some level of access.
But then that you're also thinking, okay, so you want to work illegally.
Yeah.
That's where you're coming.
That's sort of like the the local drug dealer just decides to rent some commercial space to, set up an office. I mean, what were they thinking? Anyway, no, it's really interesting times. But
there's two other things that I need to ask about before
all right.
here at the very least.
Fire away.
One, we've talked about Canopy, we've talked about Spectrum. There's one other poster on your wall there. And I think people want to know about it. There's people, it's pretty big, the vaporizing space. You guys have some of the most well-known vaporizers. Please tell us about, can we talk about, I don't. Yeah,
it's
we talk about brand
for you. We acquired a company called Storz and Bickel. Okay, Storz and Bickel being you touched on it before. People want options. They don't always want to drive a Ford or a Holden. They may want something else. And we bought the Porsche of vaporizers.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you're looking at the top of the range product and you're looking at something that has been tested, it's been certified, it basically has, in our category, we have a household product, plus we also have a medical product. So when you look at that broadly there, in Australia, we only support the medical devices here. So we actually have the medic version of the Volcano, which is more of a desktop product. I think you can see it in the background there. So if you look at the medic there, plus we also have what we call is the Mighty, which is the handheld product. So both of those products are herbal vaporizers, which we have listed on the ARTG. So these are the only products that are currently listed for vaporization in Australia. Okay. Which is great for us because we look at this now and the conversation we can go in and how we've adopted today. They look at this and go, wow, this is a different product to what we saw previously come through the door, which somebody else was trying to sell some sort of product which had no studies, nothing to support it. And they weren't sure whether or not it was going to explode tomorrow. So, and we've heard commentary to that extent. fortunately, with a product like storz and bickel, it's exciting, right? I mean, we've had an incredible product launch recently around a number of new products. We will have a new Mighty that will be released as well, which is the Mighty Plus. And that will be a medic version of that. So we're anticipating that availability will be, in weeks. So that's what we're working for at the moment.
And people and doctors, you know exactly when it's going to explode. So that's the.
Listen, as a product in our portfolio, it's one of the exciting ones, right? I think it makes us as a tech company, because I think that's the thing. I mean, you guys have referenced the fact that I came from a tech background. When I joined Canopy, it's a technology innovation company. That's what we do really well, because we've built a platform that's enabled us to produce incredible products which come from the cannabis ingredient. But at the same time, we've actually built the ecosystem around it to enable various aspects of that as well. So that's the thing that's been exciting on that front end. I've been to storz and bickel a couple of times now in Germany, and every time I go in there, it's an exciting journey because they've got something new, because there's always a new product that they're looking to bring out. Regretfully, in the last 2 years, I haven't had a chance because I'm locked away in a little bit of a bubble at the moment.
As we know that. But is I think the Mighty, which we can sort of see behind. So that's the idea of that being, pocket size, something that people can take out and about. Is it difficult?
Can I hold it in my hand to show you the size of it?
Let's have a look.
Is that permissible from your end?
Yeah, that's permissible from our end.
Let me grab it for you. I will show you what it looks like. So this is the Mighty from a size perspective. So it's sitting in the palm of my hand, pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of looks like a BlackBerry, actually. No, no, kidding.
I was waiting for the BlackBerry punch.
Yeah. Sorry.
Lots of this session.
I wanted to, but I do actually want to ask, like, have you found that obviously there's pros and cons from a doctor's perspective with, tinctures, capsules, vaporizers. Do you get resistance in terms of, it's hard to dose from a vaporizer and things like that? Or do you find that doctors generally might have sort of a pretty specific person in mind, maybe somebody who has chronic pain that flares up and that they need a sort of fast onset, and vaporizer we know is more effective for that than somebody ingesting a capsule, say?
So I will put the disclaimer out here first. I am not a doctor. I'm not a medical expert and in a position to give you advice on what you should or shouldn't be doing. With this particular...
That was good, man. I like that.
So I think well rehearsed, isn't it? So I think from my perspective, and when I look at the feedback I receive from my team on a daily basis, and we understand how the patient's gone a journey. If I think 4 years ago, when we first came through, I remember my Canadian colleagues turning around to me and said, flower will be king. Flower is always the format that people will revert to, even in the medical context or the recreational context. And they always said at some point in time, that will be the journey. But when we first came through, no one wanted to talk to us about flower. No one had an interest in it. I mean, you mentioned flower, they said no. They actually called flower marijuana. And if we put an oil in front of them, they said, medicinal cannabis.
Wow.
Okay? So that was the disparity between the two. And I remember the conversation in the very early days, and that was where it led to. I think we fast forward in the journey we've come to now. I think there's, the formats have evolved. So you have oil, we got the soft gels, and we were very unique in bringing out soft gels at one point. So enabling a physician to titrate accordingly and then be able to have fixed dosing. So I think that in itself became a key game changer in how that evolved. In addition to that, I think in the last 12 months, I think we've all seen Australia all of a sudden has exploded in this flower market. So this more active flower market. And in turn, we've seen storz and bickel business here grow rapidly, right? We launched in March or May last year, if I recall, during that period. And then we got to a period where now our team is putting these devices out the door every day because people are ordering on a regular basis. Our footprint is growing through, pharmacy channel, through to wholesalers, through to clinics and so on. Everyone looking to be able to adopt this because there's a demand for flower in the market now that doctors are comfortable prescribing flower. And that's the difference in the mindset shift. We've spent a lot of time in working with our group internally, plus also working with local physicians to better inform patients accordingly around the use of flower, but also informing other doctors around the adoption of flower as well. We carry across the entire portfolio there, but I think that's something that's definitely evolved quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely, it has.
Sorry if I've given away too much information on this podcast.
No, that's all right. I'm sure, if we need to cut anything out, we can. But no, I think that's all good.
Nah, leave it in.
Yeah, leave it in. All part of the it's all part of the education piece that we were talking about earlier.
We like it raw and uncut. That's how we like to go.
That's
just like our cannabis. No, I'm just
drizzled with trichomes
and rocks.
Yeah.
Interesting.
One other thing, and I think maybe this might take us through, but it's always nice to finish a news piece on warm and fuzzy. And I know that you guys do a bit in the social justice space overseas, and I know there's plenty of people here in Australia who would support that kind of activity and who are personally affected, like you were saying earlier about the father with the daughter who has, is it daughter who had epilepsy?
The son
who had epilepsy. And, serving time in prison or, these types of things for something that, if you were living in Canada, it would not be a crime, for example, and something that may not be a crime. Let's fast forward 10 years. So I'd love to get your thoughts on what you currently do in the overseas markets with that and how you might integrate or be integrating that already in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, definitely out of Canada and the United States, because we've got more of a GR and advocacy group working very actively there. I mean, as policy changes, so as the legalization and the regulations change and they're implemented across the board, we need to be in a position to say, what happened to those who are actually being prosecuted previously? How do we make sure that they're actually looked at, as well as potential individuals who can come into the industry, or can their backgrounds be cleared? And I think that's the balancing act accordingly. And I think one of the things that we've done as an organization is actively gone in and being able to support these programs, particularly in the United States and in Canada. And I think it's something that we've spoken about locally in regards to how these things need to look at. Have we taken enough of an active approach yet? There's time, and we will continue to look at that as we expand on a global level to be able to support these initiatives accordingly. And I think particularly when you use Canada or the US, particularly with markets that have expanded into medical as well as recreational use, that is a really strong springboard for us to be able to use that.
That's great. Especially, I mean, when I think about how many people would have, say, pre-legalized medical cannabis in Australia would have been working in the black market, still giving people what they always wanted, still meeting the demand, but having to sort of do so under the cover. And I suppose some of those people are probably wanting to join the legal industry, and maybe there's barriers there. So no, I think it's a really good initiative, what you've just been talking about. I've got no further questions, but it sounds like Mitch is champing at the bit. Have you got anything?
I'm not champing. I think that Ben's probably one of the best people to ask what we usually finish on. And he already knows what's coming. But, we've already talked about it tonight. How long, if and when adult use, recreational, Australia, when might we see it?
When is Trudeau going to call and just tell him to get it done?
We've got true don't here.
The default position that everybody gives, 5 years. I think the reality is there's back to this piece around the courage. I think people need to appreciate change can be made. Change can be implemented with the right approach. I think we need to be in a position where that 5 years could become 2 years.
Yeah.
I think we need vocal individuals who are coming out. Let me talk about the likes of Fiona Pat, for example, at a local level. Yeah. I think she takes a very strong balanced approach. She puts the facts on the table in regards to what can be done to support, whether it's patients or whether it's consumers broadly. I think we need to look at this on a broader context and look at not, there's the economic opportunity, and I think there's a significant economic opportunity for Australia. We're in a recovery position post-COVID at the moment, so we're going to have to look at what are the areas that can support us as a country today. But I think it's really getting that mindset shift, and I think that timeline can be accelerated with the right focus and the right individuals who are prepared to step forward and support that. But I think that element needs to be supported broadly with an industry that's prepared to step forward and support it as well. And I think that's what happened in Canada. There was a very supportive industry to be able to support the change. But I think in that context as well, there is no reason we can't run a dual regime or a three-way regime ultimately, where you do have a medical, you do have a wellness, plus you also have an adult use regime. So you can actually run that across the board.
Yeah. Well, as we already say, like it already exists in Australia, as we said earlier. Yeah. So that kind of, it possibly be easier to do here than even the States, where you have the states kind of taking it into their own hands to effectively roll it out as they see fit.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, it's exciting times. Listen, I think there's a hell of a lot we can do moving forward. And I think platforms like yourself definitely help that. I like the approach that you guys are taking to be able to make this more accessible and the content there available. So please keep up this work. I think it's important, right? It's not just for informing HCPs, and I think you've had some really good doctors come on and share their knowledge, but I think it's just broadening the dialogue so people can remove the stigma, because that stigma still stands.
Absolutely. And I think in kind, a lot of, I think big pharma, if you want to say, gets a bad rap sometimes, but there is definitely a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, thanks to larger companies like Canopy, for example, really pushing these things, whether or not for profit in some senses, and also for social reasons. You can't exist without making some money in business. But the reality is that it wouldn't be here if it weren't for companies like yourself. So we too appreciate the work that you guys do behind the scenes every day, showing up and making it happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Enjoy.
Thanks, Ben. We'll speak again soon.
We shall. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks.